We're going to do this again, remember? So are you paying attention? Yes. All right, this was on the section that starts clarify and define. Does everyone have that spot that says clarify and define? So it talked about what a confederacy was, and then it talked about the First Continental Congress being called in response to the Intolerable Acts. Now, if you want to be able to keep these two Congresses separate, the main thing you want to remember is the first one was called to try to patch things up with Great Britain. It was in response to the Intolerable Act. They wrote a letter saying, can you please remove these taxes and treat us like regular British citizens, and then we can just all be happy and fine. And they wrote their declaration of what their rights were as an English citizen and what their grievances were. So the First Continental Congress was still an attempt to patch things up. Now, if you're trying to patch things up, would you write the Declaration of Independence? No, it just makes common sense that wouldn't have happened at the First Continental Congress. But they did get really brave about telling the king, look, you're not treating us right, and you have to get rid of these unfair taxes. We aren't even treated as good as citizens on the continent, and we're supposed to be citizens of England, so what's the deal here? So at that first conference, you had the Adams cousins, you had Patrick Henry and George Washington and some big names that were really trying to pull this thing together and really express their discontent with the crown. So that is the First Continental Congress. Did every colony attend the First Continental Congress? No. Who didn't go?
Rhode Island.
Well, usually it's Rhode Island, you're right, but this time it was Georgia. So they weren't, Georgia wasn't there, but everyone else was. And so they felt, the Americans were making a strong statement that they felt wronged. In the Second Continental Congress, you know that was a response to what? Lexington and Concord. Therefore, the Second Continental Congress, we were really officially already at war. So isn't it logical that that's the Congress where they'd build an army and a navy and a military because they're at war with Great Britain? And now they need to get together and figure out how to handle this war. So they appoint George Washington as commander-in-chief of the army. They build up their navy, marines, and army. They start looking for ammunition to supply the army. And why are they successful at getting the army ammunition but not food and clothing? France supplied the ammunition when things got tough, but they had no money to keep the army fed and clothed and even pay them. So these guys are working in ragged clothes and they're hungry and they're not getting paid. Is it any wonder that there were people who left? They just walked away. In a way, but if they were caught deserting, they were punished. So they were in a hard spot. But that was the only way we were going to win a war, is to have our soldiers stay. And what they were saying, in effect, is if we win this war, we'll make it up to you, because they couldn't do it right then. Why did they create a postal system? Why was that so helpful?
To send messages about...
Right, for communication, wartime communication. That was important. They knew that they were fighting the greatest and strongest country, and so they needed help. So what did they create? A diplomatic corps to send people to ask other countries for help. John Adams asked Holland and England, I think, too. And who did they send to France? Benjamin Franklin, and he asked there. So the problems with the Second Continental Congress, you need to know what those were. They couldn't feed the army, they couldn't pay them, they couldn't dress them. They had no authority with the states. They couldn't say, okay, every state has to pitch in this much money to pay for the war. They couldn't tax, and they printed worthless money to try and make up the difference, and that money wasn't worth a continental. Okay, so does that make sense to you about the difference between the two? Remember, if I told you, remembering what started each conference is going to give you the answers, because the first one was started over that tax that they hated and that act where they closed the port of Boston, and so they were mad and they said, hey, this isn't fair, now let's talk about this and fix things up and do it right. But did King George respond to that? No, he didn't. In fact, Patrick Henry in his famous speech said, if they want to be friends with us, if they want to make up with us, why are there ships of war showing up? Why are there soldiers being stationed in all our cities? Is that the act of a loving country that wants to be friends? No, those are the acts of war. And they're meant for us. Does Britain have any other enemy in this territory, he asked. No, they do not. They can only be meant for us. So they saw these signs of aggression from Britain saying, okay, if you kids don't obey, we're going to make you obey. We're going to force you to, whether you like it or not. You're bad kids. Now, I often have compared in my own mind this story of the American Revolution to the story of an adolescent teenager and their parents. Because when I used to teach parenting classes, I would use a pyramid, and let me share it with you and see if this helps. I would use a pyramid because I would meet families where they were coming in with these problem kids, and yet this is how they had trained their kids. When they were babies, they put no controls on them whatsoever. So the babies, they would just say, oh, they're so young and cute, they don't need to learn anything. And then they were toddlers, and then they were, they learned to walk and all this, so they're toddlers here. I won't write it all out. And then they're preschool, where they leave home, and then they're kindergarten and elementary school and junior high, and now they're in high school. And all of a sudden, after doing nothing here, hardly anything, in high school, these parents have decided they're going to lower the boom on this kid. All right, I'm worried about you. They have a daughter. I don't want you to get pregnant. I don't want you to drink. I don't want you to end up on drugs, so I'm not going to let you do anything. And the kid is like, I've had my own way practically my whole life. Now, when I see this model, even toddlers, I can remember, let me give you a couple of examples. When Jared was a baby, he was crawling. He was probably 6 months old. And he developed this really nasty habit of wanting to chew on power cords, little cords. And he was teething, and so his teeth were sharp and could have sunk in. And what would happen to a baby with a wet mouth if he bites through an electrical cord? Not good, right? Well, here's all these people telling me, oh, you can't teach babies. They're just babies. They don't know any better. But when that child started to bite a cord, I looked at him really stern, and I said, no. And he knew by the tone of my voice something wasn't right. So he sat there with that cord, and he looked at me. I said, no. And he goes, chomp. And so the minute he did that, I took my finger like this, and I flicked his little tender, fat cheek really hard. And he dropped the cord, and he went, wah! Right? So the next time he went to bite the cord, I went, no, and he put it down. Well, he was pretty spunky. He was always kind of wanted his own way. And so one day, he crawls over to the cord, he picks it up, and he holds it, and he looks at me like this. I mean, this is a 6-month-old, and he's looking at me like, ha, 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 I have the cord. I mean, 6 months old, don't tell me they're stupid, right? He takes this cord, I say, no. He looks at me, I say no, and he goes, chomp. Oh man, I'll tell you what, he got 2 flicks on the cheek. He was wailing like crazy, and he never did it again. He has always been a little stubborn. He's the kid that jumped on a skateboard when he was less than 1, and his body filled the whole length of the skateboard, went down our driveway until he crossed the street. Good thing a car wasn't coming. Hit his face into the curb on the other side. His teeth were bleeding. His nose was bleeding. He was screaming and crying. He was fascinated with skateboards. And so we patched him up, and don't you know, later I see him starting to do the same thing. That was him as a baby. He was a strong-willed kid. So I had to teach him. He was 6 months old. Could he learn not to bite a cord? Could he? Of course he could. I mean, I couldn't have a logical discussion. You know, honey, if you bite this cord, it's going to hurt real bad and you could die and be electrocuted. I couldn't do it that way. I had to do it this way. But he could learn, right? And then when they're toddlers, you continue teaching them what they're able to learn. But I would get these parents, you know, my master's is in marriage, child, and family therapy, so I would do counseling with families who were having trouble with their kids, and I would teach these classes, and I would say, you know, look at this. You were a little bit disciplinary here. You did give some discipline, but it was not enforced. It was like, stop doing that, stop doing that, stop doing that. But if they didn't stop, they had no consequences. So these kids get to be adolescents, and adolescents want freedom. They're at the age where they're ready to separate from the family and become adults, and they want all this freedom. Well, look at what happened in America. For 160 years, they were an undisciplined child, right? They didn't have rules on them, and then all of a sudden they become adolescents, and Mother Britain starts saying, you're going to pay this tax and that tax, and you can't trade with anybody but us, and blah, 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 blah. You're going to go, you can't have any friends except your mom and dad. You know, now how would you react to that as a teenager? And so they're going through all this, and then King George decides he's going to discipline these unruly kids. Did it work? No. The model for disciplining a child is the exact opposite of this. The model for discipline goes like this. As a child matures, you gradually give them more responsibility and you lift off the weights. If you don't, what happens in the first case, if you don't discipline them and you don't let them go gradually and learn to, it's like taking a spring and going like this and smushing it. And then all of a sudden they're 18 and they leave home and you go like this. What's going to happen to that spring? It's going to fly all over the place. But if you have been gradually lifting it, preparing them for adulthood, giving them more and more responsibility, I used to tell my kids all the time, the reason I'm disciplining you on this is because I want you to learn how to discipline yourself. That was the main point. Everything I'm doing is to teach you how to discipline yourself because I'm not always going to be doing it for you. You have to take over. I might restrict your diet now and not let you eat sugar all day, but you have to learn to restrict your diet yourself. I'm showing you how it's done, but I need you to take over. And I literally would gradually give them the responsibility for their diet, for their homework, for everything. I didn't ride on my kids all the way through high school. Is your homework done? Is your homework done? Because gradually I had been saying, are you taking responsibility now for your homework? Yes, Mom. And so it works much better this way. And if it had been this way, if Britain had done these taxes from the very beginning and been more involved and managed, do you think there might not have been a revolution? Is that possible? I think so. And so I have always compared this to my parenting classes because I think it fits really well. So now, they at first they're told, you can't leave the harbor, you're on restriction. That's what the Intolerable Acts were. They were putting them on restriction. They didn't like it, so they said, you know what, this isn't fair, and they complained. But the parents said, too bad. George said, too bad, I'm not changing anything, I'm the parent here, you're the kid, and you're going to be on restriction whether you like it or not. No reasoning. And by the time a child reaches adolescence, you should be able to have reasonable discussions with them about the rules. You don't keep saying when they're 18, well, I don't care, you live in my house and that's what you're doing. You say, okay, Dad and I think this. Why do you disagree? We discuss it. We have the final word still, but you should be at a point where you can discuss it. But would King George discuss it with the colonists? He wouldn't discuss it with the colonists. So here we have this situation. Now we have Lexington and Concord happening, and it's when the king tried to tighten the rein when the Americans were too old. They were already just about through adolescence. When he did it, didn't work. Okay, so now we finally get our independence, and what we're looking at today is what did we do to try and set up a sensible government? This is so exciting because the one thing you probably never thought of that's unique in world history is that America had educated, full-grown men who'd studied about different kinds of government, and they had a clean slate, a new country, and they could design the government how they wanted. It's like if I go to Europe and I try to drive around, I get really lost because this is how the streets grew up in Europe. They had a main street here in town, but someone built a house over there, so they built a road to that house. And then they built a little carriage patch to their friend's house, and a path, I mean. And so the roads in Europe are like too narrow for cars. People park on the sidewalks because they just can't, you can hardly, some roads you can't even pass another car. Their cars are tiny, and the streets in Europe, they're a mess. They look like this. You're trying to look at a map and it's like this everywhere, and you're going like, how do I follow directions when they're going all kinds of ways? It's really maddening, and the streets aren't big enough to accommodate cars. But in the United States, when cities were built, they were laid out according to a plan. Many cities you go in, the numbered streets go east and west, the letter streets go north and south, and they're in grids. They were planned before they were built. That didn't happen in Europe. Same way with European government. It happened by helter-skelter. This guy was strong, so he took over the government, and he made them legalists, like in China. And then another guy takes over, and he makes them Confucianists. And then they combine these ideas, and then Buddhism comes in, and it just kind of like happens. But here we had a chance not just to plan roads in perfect order, but to plan a government from scratch. See, this was so unique, and you have to appreciate that. That's what makes the government strong, is that it actually was laid out with a logical plan. This is incredibly unique. I don't know of any other place in history where this has happened. So what an opportunity. No wonder these guys spent so many hours debating and talking and arguing what would be the best. Then to top it all off, they decide to try a democracy. They're trying a democracy, and at that time it's the age of absolutism everywhere in the world. Russia has a czar. China has an emperor. Africa has kings. Everybody has absolute rulers that just rule how they feel like, and they say, I don't like your face today, chop off his head. Okay? They have absolute power. They can do what they want. But here we're trying to design a government where the people have a voice, and there are checks on leaders so they can't do those irrational things. You know, we hopefully I pray to God that it'll still work in our government, that we have checks on each position in government. The executive branch, the judicial branch, the legislative branch, they check and balance each other. So neither one of those branches should be able to take control if the design works properly. And sometimes you have an incident where one branch tries to well up its head and take control of everybody else, but so far in history we've been able to manage that and keep it down. So now they're trying to plan this government. And you know, one of the first things they did was have the meeting in Philadelphia in 1787, where they spent months in the heat with the windows closed, debating and arguing and trying to work out this Constitution for the United States. And you know what's really neat about that is, you know how they say that there's wisdom in much counsel. At this point, the minds that are in this room trying to hash out our Constitution are educated and knowledgeable minds, and they're arguing. Well, that's good, because the brilliance of the government that we built is that it's based on compromise. It's based on compromise. If you had guy A in that meeting and guy B, and they saw things exactly the opposite, how would you solve the problem? Are you going to keep fighting till one gets their way? No, you're going to make a deal. You're going to come to the middle. And middle ground is what makes our Constitution, I think, so powerful, is that it is a compromise. And it also has built into it ways that it can be changed by the vote of the people. So it was pretty good. It's not perfect. It's definitely not perfect. Nothing's perfect. But it's really quite brilliant. And so they hashed this out in 87, and then they started realizing, after they got the Constitution in place, we still have a lot of things to work out. How are we going to tax the people? How are we going to pay government officials? What are we going to do with the war debt? We owe this country millions. We owe most war debt was owed to people in the United States who loaned the government money to support the war. So let's look what Hamilton came up. How many of you would like to see that play, Hamilton, that's out right now? I would love to see that play. I've seen little blips of it. But when I decided to go, the tickets were $500, and I decided to wait a little while for that one. But let's look at Hamilton's program. Okay, now I'm going to present you, before you read this, I'm going to present you with 3 problems, okay? Number 1, what are we going to do now? We're a new country, we don't have money. What are we going to do? And please think about this without reading your page. What do you think we should do with the money we owe to the other countries and the money we owe to citizens? Okay, and the problem gets complicated because, get this, some people gave the government money. I'll just make an imaginary, like $10, so it's real easy to understand. Let's say that I give the government $10 and they give me a bond for $10 that's going to grow over time, so I'll get more than my $10 back, right? I get interest on my loan. But I hit really hard times, and along comes this rich man and says, hey, I'll buy your war bonds, and right now they're not worth anything, so I'll give you $5 for them, okay? $10 bonds, I need money, so I sell my bonds off for $5. Are you with me at this point? You understand what I'm saying? Okay, now the question comes up, when these rich men have hundreds of these bonds that they bought for practically nothing, that are worth a lot more now, should we really pay them what they're worth? They didn't buy them in the first place. Should we pay them back? What do you think? How many think we should not pay them back? How many think we should pay them back? Okay, if we do not pay them back, the government is never going to be trusted again. How will we get money in the future if we don't honor our bonds? Does that make sense? Because if, yes?
Wait, so the person sells their bonds to some other person?
For practically nothing, less than they paid for it.
And it's verified by the government that that's even allowed?
Oh yeah, it's allowed. I mean, you know, no one said you couldn't sell your bonds, but people were arguing, why should we sell these bonds back to Noah? He paid $1 each for them, and now he wants $15 a piece for them because that's what they're supposed to be worth now. Why should we pay him that? We should just give him back his $1, forget it. But that hurts the integrity of the government. What happens later when we want to sell bonds to the public in an emergency? The rich people are going to say, forget you, you did us in last time. I got to watch my language here. You did us in last time, so we're not going to trust you. So, and Alexander Hamilton's idea was the government is new, it has to build trust. We need to pay back all bonds, no matter who has them, and we need to pay back the foreign countries everything we owe them. Now, there was arguments about that, but on that point, Hamilton finally won. Do you think that was a good decision?
Yes.
I do too. And then, so they did that. Now, the next problem was, how do we pay people in government? Sure, we make taxes and we get money, but what do we do with the money? Does it come in and the first person who gets it gets the money? What do we do? Well, Hamilton proposed that we set up a national bank where all this money could come in and be distributed according to certain rules, like salary or how much you get paid. This bank would also be able to make loans, business loans to the public, and that way they could make some money through loans and being paid back with interest. But people were afraid that if the national bank and all the taxes went into the government's hand, the government could become despotic and unfair, and that's a really good concern, because if the government has all the money, how are we going to force them to keep following the rules? And so they would have too much power if they had all our money, and that was kind of scary. So what did Hamilton do about that? He said 4/5 of the bank will be owned by the public, not the government. The government will only have 1/5 power in the bank. That was another good decision. And so we had the national bank. The last thing that Hamilton had to decide about was, what do we do with the goods we make and trade with other countries? When people bring goods into our country, how much should they have to pay in duty? How much, who do we send our goods to? How do we manage this? So Hamilton thought, you know what? If we want to sell American goods to American people, if we want to do that, then we need to, if anybody brings goods in, we're going to put a higher price on it. We're going to attach like a tax or a tariff, and that means that those goods will cost so much that Americans will buy American and will make more money. Is that a good idea?
No.
Who said no? Why?
Because you want other people's goods in your country, so you can if people are bringing in things from other countries, then you can charge the people bringing them in at more money at cost.
Yes, you can. And did you see what Hamilton was trying to do?
Yeah, he was trying to expand our
our local manufacturers.
Yeah, and if, like, say they bring in things and they're selling them and they're not good, then it'll encourage people to buy American than just raising the prices of other things.
It would raise the prices of anything we wanted from other countries. Now, this has been tried before. If I am, let's say I'm France, and I send certain goods, I make this wonderful lace that we make in France. So we're going to send this lace to America, but they're going to double the price before they give it to their people, hoping they'll buy American lace. So America tries to send us cotton. And because they have...
Reputation.
Yeah, what do you think I'm going to do when their cotton arrives? All right, and I don't know what goods we might have sent there, but the reason it hasn't worked in the past is because if we start putting high tariffs on their stuff, they start doing it on ours, and trade disintegrates. So that was the one thing that Hamilton wanted to do that Congress voted against. They wouldn't approve it. So 2 out of 3 isn't bad, and Hamilton was a brilliant guy. So those are the things that you're going to be quizzed on tomorrow. What happened? What was Hamilton's plan? Why did he want to do these things, and which ones were accepted and what was rejected? So here's the 3 plans. Report on the public credit. That's how much money we owed. Report on the National Bank, and report on manufacturers. Which one was not accepted? The report on manufacturers. Okay, so be ready to be quizzed on this information tomorrow, and I will see you then.